Happy Sabbath, Northside. Isn't it good to be in the house of the Lord today, where we have come to worship Him?
Good morning, Sabbath School members, those who are joining us this morning in the study of God's Word. We are so blessed to be alive, so blessed that we have the Holy Spirit. God has made available to us His words so we can learn more about Him, so that we can get ourselves ready to meet Him as well as in others.
Okay, you just missed that.
Sabbath school for this quarter, I'm extremely impressed and moved by. They've come home personally to me and others. They are dealing with principles that we find ourselves in, and how God operates, how He takes us into our trials and our temptation, the problems that we experience. And we have the guarantee that He does not only take us in, but He takes us through our problems. This morning, this week's lesson, and the entire study, deals with extreme heat. Well, study looking at our quarter's lesson, the extreme heat. It's something that tells us that all of us have problems and we have heat in life that we all experience. But some of our trials, let's say extreme, are worse than some. As we look at ourselves this morning and through the problems that we experience, and each of us can just for a moment reflect, on the problems that we have now, or the problems that we have in the past, and say to ourselves, some of these problems were extremely difficult. Some of these problems were extremely hard for us to deal. So we have your own personal experience. Problems that were not so much as difficult as others, and others that been extremely difficult. That's why we can look at our lesson this morning and identify our own life through the Word of God. How God leads us through the problems that we have. Now, a lesson for this morning, or the text this morning, very important. I hope we take a look at it. It's found in Isaiah 53, verse 10. And we need to rehearse that in our minds. Hear what it says. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He has put him in grief. Then you make his soul an offering for sin. He shall see his sleep. He shall prolong his day.
And the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hands. This text is telling us that God the Father doesn't spare his Son. Jesus found himself into extreme heat. First of all, he was bruised. His death was prophesied from the very foundation of the earth. But now the Father allowed him to experience extreme heat by the serpent bruising his son heel. But God allows that. God permit that. And as we study along during this quarter and this lesson, we have to see that God lead us into some or many of the problems and trials that we go through. Oftentimes, we tend to blame the adversary. Blame the adversary, the devil, for everything. Every problem that we encounter, we say the devil, the devil, the devil, the devil. And maybe you're right, but what I have learned from this lesson, that God allows, God permit many trials, many suffering, many pain, many misdirection, or sometimes missed opportunities. God is involved in many of these. And sometimes they become more difficult, more trying than ever. So we are seeing that the Father allowed his Son to experience difficulty, trials, and suffering, and eventually dying. So we don't have to just believe that we are the only ones going through difficulty. Jesus Christ went through it and said he has put him to grief. Jesus himself, every time we go through our trials, we have to realize, Jesus, you also go through too. So we are not just, as I said before, exclusively experiencing difficulties, but understand that Jesus went through the difficulties, the trying circumstances, in order for us to be where we are, to have life in him and through him. In the paragraph that we have before us, we can learn something not only from the memory text, but here we can find C.S. Lewis. If you read that little paragraph there, very important. And what he's saying, if we look at it, for him as a Christian, and C.S. Lewis was a very brilliant preacher, man of God. And he said what he fears the most in his Christian life is not the thought that he would forget Jesus or don't believe in God. But what worries him out is the thought that he would even consider doing that. Why is that so? What would you do without Jesus if there was no God? If there's no Redeemer? Have you ever thought to yourself, if there was no God, what would your life be? What would this world be like, if there were any, without God? Just the thought of knowing that there is no God is very, very frightening. And he said that troubled him most. And as Christians, we can ask ourselves this morning, in our individual lives, our personal experience, what would happen to you as a Christian? Going through your extreme heat, going through the problem you have, if there were not a God, if at times we couldn't take our problems to him and leave it there and cry to him, what would your life be? Ask yourself the question, the person who lives without God, the person who has no idea of what God, or choose other gods, how do they live? How do they deal with problems? How do they deal with catastrophe? If there's no God to really answer those questions, we're in trouble. What a joy it is for us to know that we have a God who is personally concerned about us, and we can take our issues to him. Oh, we can lay out our problems before him, and we can recognize that he is coming through for us. So our joys are this morning is not just that we will have problems, have experienced extreme heat, but to know that when these difficult times comes, or experiences that we did not anticipate, that we can take everything to him in prayers. And that is why we are comforted by the lesson this morning. As we study about the conflict that we go through, we are constantly being reminded that Jesus is there for us to solve our problems. In fact, have you ever experienced in your personal life where you're down and out? You're saddened, you don't know what to do, and you're so terrible, upset, stressed out, anxious, lonely. You don't know what you're doing, but you take it to the Lord in prayer, in a private chamber in your heart. You cry to God. And when you rise from your knees, that weight, that stress just go away. Why? God is there for us. And that's why we are comforted that we have a God that we know and who will care for us. Now, a question we need to ask ourselves here in this week lesson at a glance. The question is asked, why do you think God is willing to risk being misunderstood by those who he wants to know? Why do you believe God risks being understood? Do you understand God? When you're going through a problem, as we go forward, when you're going through your problem, and when I'm going through my problem, do you identify God? Or when God presents a problem to you, allow a problem to come away, the difficulties that you're going through now, can you see and understand that God is right there, or he caused the problem? Because sometimes he leads us, right? He leads us in the paths of righteousness, but he also leads us beside still waters, but also through what? The valley of the shadow of death. So we learn that God brings us into difficulties. But when he does that, does God miss being understood? Do you understand what God is doing when you find yourself in some... In fact, look at the issues that you're going through now. Let's all take a look at our personal life. Look at some of the present issues that are issues that you're going through. They might be extreme heat. Some of them are prolonged. You know, some of us are going through some problems for a very long time, looking and hoping and praying that God will come through for us, that God will answer prayer, and we're still there. During that time, does God miss being understood? Or for you, do you find yourself not understanding God? God is so merciful and kind, yet he allows us to go through problems that sometimes will cause us to misunderstand God. In fact, many of us have misunderstood God. And in my problems, I can be honest, sometimes I don't see God. Because of the human aspect of it. My own strength and weakness and the vision that I have sometimes cause me to say, God, where are you? Right now in our problems, we ask ourselves, God, where are you? Well, because of that, he missed being understood. But as we study the lesson, we realize that God is with us. All right, let's take a look at Sunday's lesson. Let us take a look at Sunday's lesson. Are you there? And this one is of reality to us. We all know the story of Abraham. What a situation that was. Can you imagine what Abraham went through? The text says Abraham in the crucible, right? Do you remember what God asked Abraham to do? Oh, man. What did he ask Abraham to do? To offer up what? His son. Now, that was an extreme heat. For you to ask me, a perfect, a holy God, a God that say, I love you, I care for you, I give you only one son that you can work with so that I will come through his seed, the only son, and I am now over 100 years old. And God is saying to me, you have to go offer up that son. Commit murder, sacrifice, be like the heathens who offer up their children. How could that be? how could God ask Abraham to do that? Ask yourself the question. How could God allow Abraham to do something like that? Did Abraham understand God? How can you understand God when he said to you at first? Abraham couldn't understand it, but Abraham trusts God. We have joined us this morning, joining me with the study, Sister Davis. Just turn the mic on and we are ready to go. And we are happy for you. Thank God for you. And we will go through this together. Just turn it on. Now, it's all right. The question I just want to reflect on you. Do you believe Abraham in his crucible? When God asked him, go offer up your son as a sacrifice. Kill him. Murder him. Be like the heathens. Sacrifice him. That Abraham at first understood God. That story there.
Yes, I think that Abraham understood God.
At first, okay.
At first, because
Turn the mic. Go ahead.
yes, I think that Abraham at first, from the beginning, he understood God because God has been speaking to him. And although we see there are some cases where, especially when God told him that he was going to be the father of many nations, the person who actually doubted more or less was Sarah. But Abraham had that faith in God, because remember what he said, that if God chose to kill Isaac, he could raise him up. He could raise him back up, so the promise would still be carried out. This is how I saw it.
All right, a question to us then. What's the difference between knowing God or faith in God? As you said, Abraham had that faith, no question about it, because of his relationship with God for many years. So no question, just to leave his country and go to a known country, demonstrate his faith in God. But the question that we need to ask ourselves, is there a difference between faith in God and understanding the trial that God is putting us through? Those who want to answer can answer. But the question that we can ask, when God put us, when we find ourselves in difficulty, like Abraham, do we always understand what God is doing?
No, we don't. We don't. And I know you have passed this already, but one of the things that I noted in the lesson was C.S. Lewis's comment, and you may have commented on that. And when I look at C.S. Lewis's comment there, when we look at the statement, do you know? The question was not, what God will do, but do you know? Do we really know what God is like? And sometimes we just don't know what God is going to do. So we are just not there. Not there.
That's good. We can have faith. Here's my approach to that. We can have faith in God, but we don't always understand what he's doing at the beginning. I don't believe Abraham understood clearly at the beginning what God was doing when he asked him to offer his only son. But as he said, Abraham trusts God and believed that whatever he's told to do, God has a purpose and would eventually work it out on his behalf. And as we have learned also, that Abraham, if you put your son to death, then he had the power to raise him up. But not all the time, times we understand God's initial purpose in our problems. So we have to allow our faith to move forward even when we don't understand God. As God's children, we have to what? Go forward in faith.
Yes, because as you rightly said, that was my thoughts really, that sometimes we do not understand what God is saying to us, but it is only by faith
Yes.
that we can move ahead and trust him.
Yeah, I like that. And that's the reality of our Christian journey. We have to move by faith at all times. And we will not know the end from the beginning, but faith will take us through. Doctor? Good.
This first story. The reason why I love this first story is it shows what you need in order to have real faith. Abraham knew the voice of God. He could not have done that if he didn't know the voice of God. He was told to kill his son. That goes against the Bible and the commandments. He said, "Thou shalt not kill." So the only reason why Abraham was able to do what and go against the 10 Commandments in his mind is because he knew the voice of God. Think about it. That means that God had spoken to him and he had gotten familiar with him. The only way we can do the hard things and increase our faith is if we grow to know the voice of God.
I wish you could just repeat that last
Yes.
statement. That's powerful.
Yes,
You have a comment? Thank you, Doctor.
That, Sister Neely, is very powerful. If we do not know the voice of God, it is impossible. Because with all the other clamors and whatever is happening, sometimes we will confuse what God is saying to us with all the other voices. So if he did not know the voice of God, and just to piggyback on what Sister Neely said, it was not just to kill. It's not just a commandment that says do not kill. But as Dr. Hines pointed out, this was a heathen practice to offer your children as sacrifice, to offer human sacrifice. So what is this? What is God telling me to do? But as we said, that, or as the Bible said, Abraham trusted God, and it was what? It was accounted to him as righteousness.
Ellen Neely.
Good morning. You know, as we're talking about crucibles, Mike, is it on? As we're talking about crucible, we need to be reminded that Abraham, I want to put some context to this, was called to leave his family. He was called to leave his family and to go, and, you know, during that time there was no internet, phone, or other communication that could take place. Leave your family and go. And then God asked him to give up his only begotten son. But we must recognize there was pain, I'm quite sure. There's some things the Bible leave out. There was suffering. I'm quite sure that was a difficult thing for Abraham. But the source of these difficulties was from who? The source of these difficulties was from God. So we need to recognize the source, because sometimes our source may be from God or may be from the enemy, because we are fallen and we are living in a broken world. And so that's very important, that yes, here it is, Abraham called, and God tell him that you gonna have as the day of the earth, right? You can't number the day of the earth. You can't number the sun, right? And so when God was saying this, he couldn't visualize this. And at the age Abraham and Sarah was, they were not of childbearing. So God sometimes say things, and that's one of the difficulties we always face. One of the difficulties is that we sometimes, because we cannot see the future, right? We can't see what the future holds, and then sometimes our faith on God are not as strong, or we doesn't move forward as we should. But Abraham is a prime example for us that even when it may seem from a human point, it's not realistic. From a human point, we can't calculate or see how it's going to happen. We have to trust and believe and know that God always is in control.
Powerful, Elder. I really appreciate that. Elder Lewis, then comment on this. Elder.
Good morning. We are still on Abraham and the call that he received from God to sacrifice his only begotten son. When we look at what God asked Abraham to do, Abraham had a special relationship with God. And God knew Abraham's heart because of that connection. So when God gave him that command, by faith, he believed that God has another way out. Why? Because God promised that he would be the father of all nations. And he knew that God gave him that son in his old age. So it was a miracle. And asking him to sacrifice his son. And he had no hesitation. He went ahead because the son asked him, said, you have the fire, you have the wood, but where is the lamb? Abraham said, God will provide. So when we have a relationship with God, we will hear the voice of God speaking to us. And because of the love we have for God, we will be obedient and do his will.
Powerful. Elder, can you just read this first paragraph there? God's. Thank you so much.
God's request.
Prophet,
Yes.
I want us to look at that paragraph that Elder is going to read for us.
God's request and its timing were not random. Indeed, it was calculated to exact the deepest possible anguish, for God has reserved his last, most trying test for Abraham until the burden of years was heavy upon him, and he was long for rest.
Bless the heart.
And that is taken from Patriots and Prophets, page 147.
I want us
Yes.
to apply, thank you so much, Elder. I want us to apply this to our lives and the situation we're going through. Those who are here and those who are on the internet or YouTube, as God's children, that we study together and we place ourselves in the problems that we're having. And what we can learn this morning, or adding to our learning, is that what God does is never miss time. You understand that? So what we read here from Ellen White, that God had the timing. So whatever I am going through with my problem, even now, is calculated by God. It's timed by God. Look at that paragraph. God, and if we understand it that way, Abraham, as we've just discussed so beautifully, might be at first did not understood what God was doing when he said, offer up my son. But because of his faith, as we all discussed, Abraham had a relationship with God, as we all discussed. So we have to say to ourselves, the problem that I have is designed by God right now. So whatever you are going through, whatever I'm going through now, not only yesterday or what is to come, in order for us to go through it, we have to say, God is at work in my life now. If we see it as random, or, as I said earlier, it's just a devil acting. We blame the devil too many times with our problems and the difficulties we are going through. The devil, when in reality, God is the one who allows us to be tempted or to go through the problems just at the right time. We might think it's not right, but surely God is at work in our lives. Are there any questions? You have any question? Go ahead.
Not just a question, it's a comment. A couple of years ago, I listened to a pastor, and he was preaching about God's timing. And what he said was that God does not set his clock off our watch. God does not set his clock off our watch. In other words, that God's timing is not our timing. He knows the timing for every area, every aspect of our lives. And just a final comment, I don't know how many of us follow the Revival and Reformation site, but this week, the prayer, it spoke about this young lady who prayed and asked God for something to lead her to someone who really needed a word from him. And she asked for it at a particular time. And when she saw that time, came to an end, she said, did I pray correctly? But guess what? God had other things in mind, because at the end of the session, Doctor, her leaders decided to do a couple more hours. And it was in that few hours that God led her to someone who really needed her. God answered her prayers exactly as he had in mind. So God doesn't set his watch off his clock off our watch. God's timing is always the right time.
Powerful, because if we understand that and apply it, then whatever we are going through, we have to say, God is at work. God is with me, and we can go forward. All right, if there are no more question for Sundays, I want us to take our time a little rather than rushing in order for us to understand God's presence in our problems, because all of us are experiencing some form of difficulties, the trials, the temptation, the hardship. We're going through that, and if you are not going through any now, be glad, but it will come. So if we can understand God's presence in our problem, we can really go through it as Abraham did. All right. Interesting example here on Mondays. Wayward Israel. All right. Do we remember the story of Hosea and Gomer? How many of us can recall it? We don't have to read it, but can recall the story. Elder, do you have any recollection of that and how terrible it is?
Doctor, being someone who is married, I don't know. But when we look at the story of Gomer and Hosea, if we just eliminate that or just forget that it is talking about God and Israel, if we are just looking at a relationship between a man and his wife, or a man and a woman, and we see what happened, and we see the patience of Hosea when it came to his wife, I don't think we should have a problem in seeing God as a loving, faithful, not just Father, but a loving, faithful Savior. Because this is what Hosea was to Gomer here.
It is interesting that God used. First of all, this is not a universal application of how God operates, but in a unique sense, that his person using Hosea and Gomer as an example of his love for Israel, his tenacity. So if we see it more as God's love working through
the depth of love that God has for Israel. But notice this restriction. It's a how as a Christian technology uses. Now, I'm sure
or Elal, you have an example of that of Pastor Heinz or anybody say, throw him out. He has broken the commandment. He's not worthy. Yet God used an extreme situation. Right? To demonstrate his love. Say, you go and take up this woman, a prostitute. And over again, she messed up. And God said, go back to her. So, look at ourselves. Not only is ancient Israel as a nation, but you and me as God's children. God's love keep on coming at us. What would it be for us as Christians if God said, give him 10 times? You know what? Abraham tried that with God too. You remember the situation of Abraham and Jesus and Sodom? You remember that? Abraham tried to put a number on it, right? Right? If you have 10, if you have 15, you have 20, whatever it is. But God doesn't put number as to how many times he will deliver us. His love is there, and as long as we will respond to the call of repentance and to come to him, God will. And we are so blessed to see God use an extreme situation, going out of the commandments, in order to get the message across that he loved Israel.
Couple of years ago, Walter Pearson is dead, but he had a series of sermons, and one of them was Relentless Pursuit. And I would watch that sermon over and over again. Relentless Pursuit. And it spoke about God's relentless love because he keeps coming after us. And it is portrayed here in the story of Gomer and Hosea as God in the story of Israel, God and Israel, how he relentlessly pursued them and tried to woo them back to him.
That's very powerful. Elder, come forward. But God's love is relentless. For me, let's try to apply it to ourselves this morning. God's love is relentless, and he will do anything that it takes to save us.
We're talking about crucibles. And Israel, as was stated, Gomer and Hosea, that here we see Israel went after all sorts of gods, all sorts of idols, right? And that is the way it is with us. Idol could be entertainment, idol could be laziness, idol could be anything, right? And yet, as Hosea did with Gomer, even though Gomer went out and had other relationship, yet still he was willing to take her back. But the source of Israel's suffering and pain was because of Israel's rebellion. And so that tells us that sometimes when we go through suffering and pain, it's because what? Our rebellion. Not because of God, but because of our rebellion. But you know what is interesting in this story is that Israel, even though it went after false God, and Gomer went out and had all sorts of relationship and prostitute, yet still Israel repent and return back. Gomer came back, and Gomer say, you are no longer master, but what? Husband. Okay? And it's the same way with us, that we go out, we commit sin, we do wrong, and we might look and say, boy, how could God want this man to take this woman back when she done did something wrong? But take our own life, and we take our own life and apply Israel, we apply Gomer, and we see how many times we have done wrong, how many times we have sinned. and have not been faithful, but yet still God love and care for us.
Powerful. Go ahead.
And Pastor Patrick, Patrick Vincent, I don't know how many of you know Pastor Patrick Vincent. I like to refer to these sermons. He preached a sermon once and he said, and this we can apply to this stage, our crucible sometime is not because it's our cross, but our crop. It's what we sow. It's not your cross, it's your crop. And that is what, in a nutshell, Elder Neely was saying. With Israel here, Israel, most of the time, their problem was their crop, what they sow. It wasn't their cross.
I want to come, Elder. I want to, as Elder Lewis is coming to ask a question, look at two concerns here, and as you look at your problem, look at what you're going through, what you've been through, and ask yourselves the first question. We're going to go back to it. We risk not recognizing that God is at work. Two, we risk misunderstanding God when He is at work. We'll discuss that after Elder Lewis.
When we look at the story of Homer and Hosea, now, Israel knew what God commanded them, because in Deuteronomy verse 11, Moses reminded them of God's blessings and also reminded them of the curses. He told them if they keep God's commandments, they will receive blessings. But if they disobey, they will be cursed. And when God used the analogy, I would say, with Homer and Hosea, it was to call Israel back to him because they had gone astray. And he made a promise with Abraham. And God is a God who keeps his promise. So he allowed them, in other words, to go through whatever they were going through to realize that he is God. And I gave you commandments. And I told you that if you obey me, I will bless you. And if you disobey me, you will receive the curse that I placed upon you. And this is what they were going through. And God loved Israel so much that he had to call them back to him. And that is the same thing that God is doing with us today. He's calling us back to him.
Thank you so much, Elder. Elder Davis, I am moved by this story of Hosea. But he was an innocent man. How do you feel as a child of God going through all that you're going through now? And Hosea, he was righteous. God could use him because of his faithfulness. God could depend on him to act the way he did. But here he was a faithful man, innocent in all this doing. Yet God put his faithful servant into an extreme heat that he could say, God, I don't want it more. How do we see ourselves being placed in an extreme heat when it's not because of your doing, as you said earlier, the crop that we're reaping, but because God is using us to accomplish his task or to bring others back to him? Is that fair?
We just have to look at the story of Job. We just have to look back at the story of Job, because here we see Job being a righteous man. And sometimes we cannot understand. Dr. Hines cannot understand why God put us through this. And Job, we just have to look at what the Son went through for us. He did no sin. Yet, I know, doctor, would you stand and allow someone to spit in your face and to do that? Just this week I had an experience where we were talking about Jesus, in my husband and I, as we studied. And I said, Lord, I am yet to be at that place where I am accused of something and not say a word. So we just have to look at that, because why Hosea, and why did Hosea do all this? Although we look and we see it's an analogy where Christ is Hosea. That is the image of God, portraying the love of God for a nation that continuously go against him, continuously, spurn his love. We can't understand. It's only by faith that we can really accept what is happening here.
That's good. I want to turn these two issues that present here in verse 1 and 2. What is the problem? What problem do we run when we don't see or recognize God at work? When we are going through a problem, what problems do we face? What do we risk when we don't recognize that God is at work in our problem? Going through now, but we don't recognize. What risks do we run? Elder, you can come. Sister Elder, go ahead while he comes.
We run the risk of going our own way and reaping the benefits or reaping the repercussions of doing our own will, when we do not recognize the leading of God in our lives. Because when we look at what Job did, he worshipped. And what do we do the first time we come upon problem, especially when we are in church and the problems start coming in? Our children start wandering away from the faith, and our husband may be going the opposite. What do? The first thing, we stop going to church. I come to church and Elder John Lewis look at me and maybe the wrong, no, I'm not going back to Northside. I'm not going back to church. So it's when we do not see God in these crucibles that we run the risk of spurning God and turning our own way.
Elder, thank you so much. That's great.
I wanted to just offer a comment. Sometimes, and we're talking about crucibles and extreme heat. Obviously, the extreme heat is to get out all the impurities. But for some individuals, when they go through extreme heat, they don't believe in God no longer. They don't believe in God no longer. The heat is so much, they lose all faith in God and trust in God. There are some individuals, as they go through the extreme heat, their view of God is totally corrupted. If I'm serving an all-powerful God, then how is God allowing me to go through the suffering and pain? Then he can't be all-powerful. Or maybe he's weak, and that's why he can't do nothing about it. Okay? So when we go through these, is that we must realize that even though we may be down, yes, we're going through these pains and we're going through these suffering, we may be down, but we must have that hope and assurance that one day that we look forward to a new heaven and a new earth if we are faithful, and God not only takes us, he said he will never leave us or forsake us. He not only takes us, but sometimes he carries us through when we're going through what we're going through, and he'll never allow more to come on us than than we can bear, even though sometimes it feels like that.
Thank you, Elder. Just the other thought, but we'll just move on. We risk misunderstanding God when He is at work. I want us to contemplate those two questions as whenever we go home, sentences, but turn them into a question and see what happened to you along with Elder Davis's comment. Now, we go over to Tuesday, worship. We talk about what? Job. Let's deal a little bit more with Job. Elder Davis, touch on him very carefully. And the question we need to ask ourselves here, what caused Job's suffering? And the reason that question is applicable and powerful, we have to understand and to know when in our problems or through our problems, we are not alone, but God is at work. What difference would it make if I am having some financial problem and I can say to myself, you know, God is working with me. Rather than complaining, murmuring, and ready to give up, I can say, Lord, you are at work with this problem. Elder?
One of the things we have to really take into consideration here is that Job did not know what was the root cause of his suffering. And after a while, after we get into the book of Job, which we are not going to be going into, but it asks, what caused Job's suffering? And Elder, I have a problem with the whole issue there, and I used to question it. Why did God allow Satan in this meeting? And if we look here, Satan wasn't the one who singled out Job. It was God who said, have you considered my servant Job? So, I am going to turn back to you, Doctor, with a question. Why did God put Job in this crucible? Well, why did God do that to Job? It's like God was throwing Job under the bus. Was it?
No. If we look at Hosea, it's the same situation with Job. God had faith in Job that he would prove to be faithful to him in a time of crisis. God, as the Father, the Son, and knowing all, he trusts us that we serve him not out of fear, that not all the blessings, many times we serve God because of the blessings that we receive. And that, in fact, that was Satan's accusation. Oh, you have him hedged around. You give him all that he wants to have. He's your boy, so I can't touch him. Jesus said, no, he serves me out of what? Love, right? And God was willing to put him to the test because he knew that Job would come out faithful. So we understand it there. But notice what we ought to do. If someone has a comment, fine, but we move. Notice what we ought to do, what Job did rather. And you brought that out earlier. When Job experienced his problem, did he run away from church, as I said, Elder? Did he curse the church? Did he blame others? What he did, he worshiped. Job worshiped God in his problems, in his not understanding God, he still worshiped him. And that is how we ought to behave. That's how we ought to respond to a problem. Worship God instead of complaining and instead of saying, God, you're not there. God, you don't care. But he worshiped. I want to point this out, Elder, what the problem that we have that Job had. Job's biggest problem was not that he didn't trust God or trust himself or willing to go through the problem or even ask God or to question God. Job was saying, God, why are you giving me the silent treatment? Watch that.
Yes.
Why are you giving me the silent treatment? Just answer me. Just let these people know that I'm with you. Just show up. Let them know that I'm not just here doing my own thing, but I'm a faithful servant. And God did not say a word. And that really pressured Job. Not the problems he was going through. He could have dealt with that, and he dealt with it. But say, God, speak to me. One of the biggest problems that we experience in our personal lives, our everyday life, and when we are going through our crucible, is when God keeps silent on us. Have you been there? Yes. Oh my, you're not there. Yes. Let me tell you. Oftentimes, we say, God, where are you? Yes. What's going on? I've been praying, and praying and praying for months after months. And in some cases, year after year. Yes. Deliver me, Lord. And God just sits silent. The greatest stress that we will experience in our suffering, in our crucibles, elder, is when it appears that God just sit there and does nothing. He just remains silent. But in the end, he came out faithful. And in fact, I think last week, Dr. Neela brought this out, and this powerful statement, Job chapter 23, verse 10. Powerful statement she brought out that Job made. Job said, God, answer me. You know, when I go through all of this, I'm still going to come out like pure gold. You know, that is such a powerful statement for a man in the kind of suffering that could say to God, you know, on my part, I am going to be faithful to you. Answer me. And God just sat there for that time. Elder?
There is something, I know we all saw it in our studies, but the last paragraph on Mondays with Job, it says in Job 1:20 and 21, we see what? 3 aspects of worship that may help when in anguish. 3 aspects. And the first one was that Job accepts his helplessness and recognizes that he has no claim to anything. And we have to come to that place where we recognize that we are helpless. And you see his response. Naked I come, naked I go. Second, Job acknowledges that God is still in control. Even when he is silent, he is still in control. And third, Job concludes by reassessing his belief in the righteousness of God. May the name of the Lord be praised. How can we praise God in our crucibles? We have to know him. We have to know him. Not just know about him, we have to know him. And those really spoke to me, not just in this lesson, but reading the book of Job. These aspects really spoke to my heart.
Just to add to the 3 comments that you have made, what is important to us in the materialistic world, the world in which we live, and we grasp after material things and we want it and we're doing very well, and we have accomplished. When we have accomplished well and we go forward, we have the tendency to lay claim on our accomplishments. We have to say, well, I've worked hard for it. Or I've been to school for 4, 5, 6, 7 years, I'm this and that. I have this job, I have this big bank account, and I'm doing very well. And we lay claim to it, say, well, it is mine.